Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The hall was filled with glittering lights and glowing faces. The 15th anniversary of Obinna Eze's group of companies was a national event. Cameras flashed, CEOs toasted champagne, and journalists waited breathlessly to document every moment. On the grand stage, Chief Obinna Eze stood tall and proud, his tailored burgundy agbada gleaming beneath the chandeliers. Beside him, his wife Adanne and their twin teenage daughters, Chimamanda and Chizitir, stood quietly, their smiles soft, their hands gently holding one another's. The girls had dressed in matching Ankara gowns with subtle embroidery of their father's logo stitched near the hem. They had spent days planning to surprise him with an emotional video tribute. But Obinna had other plans. When the host called him to give his anniversary speech, Obinna grabbed the microphone, cleared his throat, and turned to his family, not with gratitude, but with disdain. "I have built all this with blood and sweat," he said loudly. "But look at my house. No son to carry my name. I am surrounded by decoration." A nervous laugh echoed from the crowd. Adanne's hand trembled. Chimamanda's eyes watered. Chizitir lowered her head in shame. Gasps rippled across the hall. Obinna wasn't done. "They say I have 2 daughters, but to me," he looked at the girls, his voice like stone, "they are not heirs. They cannot carry legacy. A man with no son is a tree with no roots." Adanne froze. Her mind screamed, but her lips held silence. She reached for her daughters as they quietly began to cry. One of them had handmade a necklace for him, which now fell from her pocket onto the marble floor. Obinna turned back to the audience and declared, "That is why I am doing everything I can to secure my name. I will not be mocked in my grave." His voice thundered like judgment. The crowd clapped awkwardly, some looking away in discomfort, others smiling to remain politically correct. Adanne wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole. Her heart shattered, not just from her husband's cruelty, but because her daughters had heard every word. Those words would burn into them forever. Her children were never useless. But in that moment, Obinna had murdered something sacred. As the program ended, Adanne and her daughters quietly left through the back entrance. Photographers still shouted for family portraits, but she pretended not to hear them. Chimamanda sobbed the entire ride home, while Chizitir bit her lip till it bled. "Why doesn't Daddy want us?" Chimamanda whispered. Adanne had no answer. In her room, later that night, she wept alone. Her marriage, once filled with tenderness and shared dreams, had become a public circus of insults and humiliation. She had tried everything, prayers, fasting, IVF, and surgeries, just to make him happy. But Obinna wanted only a son. And now, not even the innocence of their daughters could shield her from his growing contempt. It was the night something inside her broke, but she didn't know just how far this storm would go. Long before the glittering halls and bitter words, there had been hope. Adanne had met Obinna when she was just 23, fresh out of nursing school and full of dreams. He was charming, confident, and already building his first company. Their love had been real, at least at first. But the fairy tale began to wither after their wedding, when whispers from his mother and relatives filled his ears. "No baby yet? Is she a man? Your mates already have sons running in their compounds." At first, Obinna defended her. But as the months dragged into years, pressure turned into poison. After her first miscarriage, Adanne nearly lost her life. She had cried into Obinna's chest, thinking it would draw them closer. Instead, he grew colder. For 6 long years, Adanne battled infertility like it was a war. Multiple surgeries, painful injections, and failed IVF treatments left her body scarred and her soul weary. There were nights she couldn't even stand to face her reflection. Her once flat stomach now bore surgical lines, reminders of her battlefield. Obinna stopped attending appointments. He instead spent late nights at clubs, claiming it was work. But Adanne kept going, holding on to the hope that one child, just one, would change everything. Finally, in her 7th year of marriage, her doctor gave her the news. She was pregnant with twins. High risk, fragile, but real. She prayed, sang, and laid flat for months. She lost her hair, gained over 30 kilograms, and vomited daily. And when she finally held those two little girls in her arms, tiny but breathing, she felt like she had won the world. But Obinna? He had barely smiled. He named them out of obligation, not joy. He gave the nurses envelopes, but not his heart. At least now they will stop asking, he said as he carried the twins like they were a burden. The love Adanne had for him began to fade, slowly, like candle wax. Yet she stayed, hoping he'd come around. Instead, he withdrew into his work, often disappearing for days. He never once took the girls to school, never changed a diaper, and never told them bedtime stories. Even when Chimamanda won a national spelling bee, he brushed it off. If it were a boy, it would have made the news. Adanne realized then that her womb had given life, but to a man who would never truly see it as a gift. The day Amarachi returned, the sky was unusually gray. Adanne had just returned from the market when she saw a sleek black car pull up to the compound. The driver opened the door slowly, and out stepped a woman in high heels, red lipstick, and a flowing designer gown. Adanne's heart dropped. She would know that walk anywhere, even if it had been 10 years. It was her twin sister, Amarachi, the one who had disappeared after being disowned for sleeping with Adanne's fiancé before the wedding. The one who had mocked her when she was battling infertility. The one who had vowed never to return to that cursed family. And yet, there she was, smiling like nothing had ever happened. "I heard you married a billionaire," Amarachi said, stepping closer. "So, this is how the other half lives." Her voice was drenched in mockery, but her eyes scanned every corner of the compound with hunger. Adanne didn't reply. She wanted to close the gate in her face, but something told her that Obinna wouldn't allow it. And she was right. That evening, when Obinna came home and saw Amarachi in the parlor, his eyes lit up in a way Adanne hadn't seen in years. "This is your twin?" he asked, shocked. "She looks like you, but bolder." Amarachi grinned and replied, "Let's just say I didn't waste my life being quiet." Obinna laughed. Adanne's stomach turned. Within weeks, Amarachi had made herself at home. She wore silk robes in the hallway, sipped wine by the pool, and joined Obinna on business lunches. Adanne began to notice her perfume lingering on Obinna's shirts and her laughter echoing too long in his office. The girls were uncomfortable around their aunt, who always called them half-women. One day, Adanne overheard Amarachi on the phone, saying, "I will take everything she thought was hers. The man, the house, and the throne. Watch me." That night, Adanne couldn't sleep. She clutched her daughters and silently prayed. She had survived a war in her womb. But what was coming next would be a war in her own home. Adanne had always known that Amarachi could steal attention, but she never thought she would watch her sister deliberately steal her home. Days turned into weeks, and the walls of the mansion no longer echoed with the laughter of her daughters. Instead, they vibrated with the flirtatious chuckles of Amarachi and the deep, approving laughter of Obinna. Amarachi took every opportunity to belittle Adanne in subtle, calculated ways, commenting on her aging skin, on her plain wrapper, on how motherhood had stretched her figure. "You really did sacrifice everything," Amarachi said one day, sipping wine at breakfast. "Pity he didn't see the value." Obinna laughed at the remark. Adanne sat there, dying inside, with Chimamanda beside her, trying to pretend she didn't hear. Amarachi was not just visiting. She was replacing her. It became clear when Obinna started taking Amarachi to events he once attended with Adanne. She would leave the house draped in gold, wearing expensive perfumes and shoes Adanne once dreamed of. At night, Amarachi would stay late in his private study, where no one else was allowed. When Adanne confronted Obinna about boundaries, he dismissed her with a smirk. "She's family. Why are you being so dramatic?" But even the staff began to whisper. One morning, Adanne caught one of the housekeepers folding Amarachi's clothes and muttering, "She's already the second madam." The humiliation became unbearable. The daughters noticed, too. Chizitir began wetting the bed again. Chimamanda stopped drawing. And one night, When Adanne kissed them goodnight, Chimamanda asked, "Mummy, are you going to leave us too, like Daddy left you?" Then came the night everything changed. Adanne overheard Amarachi speaking to Obinna in his private lounge. "She gave you girls. I can give you what you truly deserve. A son. A king. Just say the word." Obinna's silence didn't last long. "And what will you want in return?" he asked. "A life," Amarachi said. "The one I was denied." Adanne backed away from the door in horror. She had feared this, but hearing it confirmed felt like someone had reached into her chest and ripped her heart out. She collapsed in her bedroom that night, not from weakness, but from a realization that she was fighting two wars, one with her husband's pride and another with her own blood. It wasn't just betrayal. It was war dressed as family. It was a deal born of arrogance and desperation. Obinna was a man obsessed with legacy, and Amarachi was a woman starving for relevance. When their hands met in secret that night, something vile was birthed between them, a child born of betrayal, ambition, and wounded egos. Amarachi made herself available in every way, learning his routines, flattering his mind, and caressing his pride. Obinna, convinced that fate had delivered him a second chance through the very twin he once ignored, succumbed to her completely. He called it strategy, a necessary sin to birth a future. "Let's keep this between us," he told her. "No one can know until it's done." Amarachi smirked. "Of course," she whispered. "Your secret is safe with me for now." While Obinna danced deeper into his delusion, Adanne drifted further into silence. Her daughters clung to her, trying to understand why their father now avoided them entirely. Chimamanda, once bright and talkative, stopped raising her hand in class. Chizitir's grades dropped. And Adanne? She became a ghost in her own home, retreating into her sewing room and praying for strength. Every day felt like walking barefoot on hot coals, Amarachi's voice growing louder, Obinna's love growing colder. And then it happened. Amarachi missed her period. A hospital confirmation followed, and within days, she burst into the dining room with a fake gasp, clutching her stomach. "I'm pregnant," she said, loud enough for even the housekeepers to hear. Obinna stood and embraced her. "You've saved my name," he said. "You've given me a future." Adanne dropped her spoon. That night, Adanne locked herself in her room and screamed into a pillow while her daughters sat outside the door, crying too. Amarachi strutted around the house like a crowned queen. Even Obinna's mother came to visit, bringing a wrapper and gold necklace to welcome the true mother of his heir. At dinner, Obinna gave a toast to Amarachi, not to his wife. "We shall name the boy Obinna Jr.," he declared. "For legacy, for honor." Adanne left the table, her hands trembling. It wasn't just betrayal. It was abandonment in its rawest form. She realized something terrifying. Obinna wasn't just cheating. He was replacing her, erasing her existence one step at a time. Obinna spared no expense in glorifying the pregnancy. From the moment the scan confirmed the baby was a boy, he became intoxicated with celebration. He threw a grand party at a luxury hotel, complete with a live band, fire dancers, and politicians in attendance. The halls were lined with banners that read "A king is coming." Amarachi wore a flowing blue gown, her bump proudly displayed as she waved like royalty. Cameras flashed, and Obinna stood beside her like a groom on a second wedding day. Adanne and the girls watched it unfold on television. Chimamanda held her mother's hand tightly, while Chizitir whispered, "He didn't throw a party when we were born." Adanne's face remained calm, but her heart shattered in silence. Obinna's pride reached new heights. He began speaking publicly about succession plans and male legacy. Business journals quoted him calling Amarachi a divine gift. Internally, he began drafting a new will. The staff at the mansion now treated Adanne and her daughters like strangers. Amarachi redecorated parts of the house, changing curtains and throwing out old portraits. One afternoon, Adanne came home to find that her wedding portrait had been removed from the hallway, replaced with a maternity photo of Amarachi cradling her belly, framed in gold. That night, Adanne didn't cry. She simply packed 2 suitcases, called her daughters, and quietly walked out of the house. Obinna didn't even notice until the next day. They moved into a modest two-bedroom flat on the outskirts of town. Gone were the marble floors and chandeliers, but in their place was something Adanne hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The girls shared a room, decorated with paper stars and hand-drawn affirmations. Adanne returned to her sewing, using an old machine she'd once gifted to a former maid. Her hands ached, but her heart began to heal. They started anew, not because they had nothing, but because they were no longer clinging to a man who had already thrown them away. And though Obinna continued to rise in the public eye, believing his son was his redemption, a storm was coming. And when it landed, it wouldn't just break him. It would bury everything he built on lies. The morning was humid and eerily silent in the Eze mansion as Adanne quietly zipped up the final suitcase. There was no announcement, no yelling, no dramatic farewell. Just silence. Her daughters stood by the door, clutching their backpacks, eyes wide with fear and heartbreak. Chimamanda kept looking back, as if still expecting her father to appear and stop them. But Obinna hadn't been home the night before. He had taken Amarachi on a baby moon getaway. Adanne wrote no letter, gave no warning. Her decision had ripened after weeks of dying silently under the same roof where she once believed in love. She was leaving with nothing but her children, a handful of clothes, and a heart full of scars. As she closed the main gate behind her, she whispered a prayer, not for vengeance, but for the strength to survive. They moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet area miles away from the bustling city, where Obinna's name commanded respect. There were no marble tiles or personal drivers, just leaking faucets and humming fans. But for the first time in years, Adanne felt she could breathe. She enrolled the girls in a nearby school and returned to the only skill that once gave her independence: tailoring. She fixed torn uniforms, stitched wrappers, and eventually opened a small shop. The girls, though wounded, began to bloom in the safety of her arms. Chimamanda found joy in painting again, while Chizitir started volunteering at the local clinic after school. They spoke very little about their father, but the pain hung over them like dust, unspoken but ever present. Every time a car honked near their gate, Chimamanda would flinch. Back in the mansion, no one questioned Adanne's absence. Not Obinna, not his staff, not even his mother. Amarachi had already taken full command. She moved into Adanne's former bedroom, redecorated the nursery with golden cribs, and referred to herself as Madam Eze. Obinna didn't seem to care. He was obsessed with the growing belly that carried his legacy. He told friends and partners that God had finally answered him. At night, he read baby boy-name books and posed with Amarachi for tabloid covers. Adanne heard all from the newsstands outside her shop. She would glance at the headlines: Heir of Eze, Empire coming soon. Then lower her eyes, smile faintly, and return to stitching. She knew something Obinna didn't. The louder a man boasts, the closer his fall. The girls' new school was smaller and less prestigious, but their mother's presence made it feel safer. Still, the wounds their father left behind couldn't be patched by new uniforms or class timetables. Chimamanda, who once topped her former school in every subject, now sat silently in class, barely making eye contact with teachers. The humiliation of seeing herself and her sister blasted online as the forgotten girls had etched itself into her spirit. Some classmates whispered, "Isn't that the billionaire's daughter he rejected?" Chizitir, always the feisty twin, fought anyone who insulted their mother or mentioned Amarachi's name. She was suspended twice for aggressive behavior. Each time, Adanne sat with her at home, trying to explain that silence was not weakness, and that forgiveness was not surrender. But the pain was too fresh, the rejection too loud. Their father had not just turned his back, he had made sure the world knew why. Obinna, on the other hand, hadn't even noticed their withdrawal. To him, the girls were history, mistakes from a time when he wasn't fully blessed. He told anyone who would listen that his daughters had been part of a season of spiritual punishment. "God punished me with girls, but now he's giving me a son," he said during an interview with a national newspaper. That quote went viral. Chimamanda read it in the library. She didn't cry. She simply folded the paper, walked home, and didn't eat for 3 days. Chizitir begged her to speak. Adanne cried into her pillow that night, knowing the kind of damage words could inflict more than fists ever could. She wrote in her journal, "I fear not Amarachi's pregnancy, but what my daughters will become if they believe his lies." Meanwhile, Obinna was throwing more lavish gifts at Amarachi than most kings gave their queens. Gold bangles, imported strollers, prenatal spa sessions, and even a personal chef. Amarachi soaked it all up like a sponge, bathing in luxury and flaunting her status as the mother of the heir. Every few days, she posted pictures online, "Legacy secured, God finally remembered me," and hashtag Queen Mother. She even granted an interview claiming she was chosen by the gods to restore the Eze bloodline. Adanne didn't respond, but the girls did. Chimamanda locked herself in the bathroom and painted a black canvas she called Invisible Daughters. Chizitir began writing letters addressed to Daddy, only to burn them afterwards. It wasn't just neglect. It was abandonment weaponized by pride. And while Obinna celebrated his future, he was unknowingly burying his past, the very past that held the only people who ever truly loved him. It was a day Obinna believed would change history. The delivery room was transformed into a scene from a royal film: bouquets, camera crews, and expensive wines for the medical staff. Amarachi gave birth to a baby boy weighing 3.4 kilograms. He was healthy, dark-skinned like Obinna, with eyes that darted quickly around the room. Obinna cried, not tears of love, but of triumph. "Obinna Jr.," he announced, holding the child like a trophy. The name continues. That night, he threw a private celebration at his estate with fireworks, gourmet meals, and a cake shaped like a crown. Guests toasted to the savior of the Eze Empire. Amarachi lay in silk robes, drinking champagne from a golden flute, wearing a tiara that said Queen of Legacy. Not once did Obinna think of his daughters that day. Not once did he remember Chimamanda's 9th birthday, when she had drawn a portrait of him in crayons and called him my king. Not once did he remember Chizitir's poem titled "The Day My Father Smiled." To him, the boy had erased the past. Amarachi, now officially installed in the mansion's main suite, basked in the glory. Every room echoed with the sound of praise. Obinna even commissioned a gold crib and hired a nanny from Switzerland. Meanwhile, Chimamanda and Chizitir watched the entire naming ceremony online from their mother's phone. "Obinna Jr.?" Chizitir said, almost spitting. He named him after himself. Chimamanda didn't say a word. She just stared and quietly pressed mute. A week later, Obinna summoned his lawyer to begin drafting a new will. "Remove the girls from succession," he said coldly. "They are no longer relevant." The lawyer, Mr. Okonkwo, paused. "Sir, they are still legally your children. It would be unwise to disinherit them without cause." Obinna waved him off. "I'll provide for them. But everything important, everything powerful, goes to the boy." Okonkwo nodded, but made a mental note. He had watched Obinna rise from nothing. But now, with the look in his eyes and the weight of pride on his shoulders, he saw something he hadn't seen before. A man building his empire on a foundation of betrayal. And when betrayal is the foundation, collapse is never far away. The new mansion sat on a private hilltop in Abuja, draped in imported marble and surrounded by gold-plated fences. Obinna called it the House of Legacy. It was a gift to Amarachi and her newborn son, Obinna Jr., and he made sure everyone in the country knew about it. The housewarming party was aired on national TV, complete with helicopters dropping flower petals and traditional dancers performing in the driveway. Obinna gave a speech, eyes glistening with pride, declaring his newborn son the foundation of a new dynasty. Amarachi stood next to him, glowing in an emerald green wrapper stitched with her name in diamonds, cradling the baby like a queen holding her crown. He had written the boy's name in stone at the mansion's entrance, literally carving his delusion into walls that would soon betray him. Back in their small apartment, Adanne and the twins watched the coverage unfold like a bad dream on their neighbor's TV. Chimamanda sat in silence, while Chizitir clenched her fists in fury. "He built a house for her. Chizitir Espat. We begged for school shoes last year, and he said there was no money." Adanne didn't speak. She couldn't. Her heart felt like stone. The image of Amarachi smiling beside Obinna, in the very place Adanne once called home, was a punch she had not prepared for. The betrayal was no longer a wound. It had become a performance. Her daughters had to watch their father replace them, not in secret, but in headlines. And what hurt most wasn't just the betrayal, it was the silence. Obinna hadn't once called them, not even to say the child was born. They no longer existed in his narrative. The community around them started to react. Even in their church, people whispered, "That's the woman Chief Obinna left," they'd say. "Her twin took everything." Some pitied them, others mocked them. A few reporters tried to get Adanne to comment, but she remained silent. Instead, she buried herself in her work, stitching clothes until her fingers bled. But the girls were not as strong. Chimamanda developed insomnia, waking up at 2 a.m. to paint images of broken houses and faceless men. Chizitir began to isolate herself, refusing to speak to her classmates. Adanne saw the slow erosion of their light, and it terrified her. She wanted to fight back, but how do you fight a man who owns the cameras, the microphones, and the truth? She decided that night she would teach her daughters not just how to survive betrayal, but how to rise without needing applause. Mr. Okonkwo was an old man, seasoned by years of watching rich men fall on swords they had sharpened themselves. Sitting across from Obinna in the glass-walled office of Ease Holdings, he adjusted his reading glasses and carefully laid out the preliminary draft of the will. "Are you absolutely sure, sir?" he asked again. "You want to leave everything to this child?" Obinna, basking in arrogance, waved his hand like a monarch dismissing a beggar. "That boy is my legacy. Those girls, they'll be taken care of. But this empire? It must pass to a king." Mr. Okonkwo hesitated. He had always been loyal to Obinna, but he knew what pride could do to men like him. It wasn't always quick, but it was always fatal. After the meeting, Okonkwo sat in his car, troubled. Something felt off. Amarachi's name had come up in a financial audit a few weeks back. Large transfers, extravagant purchases beyond even Obinna's reach, and most disturbingly, irregularities in the company's offshore accounts. He decided, against his better judgment, to make a quiet suggestion. The next morning, he returned to the estate with a calm smile and a casual tone. "Sir," he said, "before we proceed with the final version of the will, I advise, purely for legal protection, that we run a paternity test on the boy, just for documentation. It's standard protocol for high net worth succession." Obinna flinched, his pride rising like smoke. "I don't need a test to know my son," he snapped. "I feel it in my spirit." But Okonkwo gently insisted. "Feelings can't stand in court, sir." After pacing and grumbling, Obinna reluctantly agreed. "Fine," he muttered. "Do it, but keep it quiet. I don't want Amarachi knowing." Okonkwo nodded, but deep down, he feared the damage had already been done. The test was carried out swiftly, a simple swab from the child's pacifier and one from Obinna's coffee cup. It would take 10 days for the full analysis. In those days, Obinna remained oblivious, parading his son like a war medal, arranging meetings with international investors, and boasting about the heir he believed would someday sit on his throne. But in the corners of his mind, doubt began to creep in. Amarachi had been too eager, too theatrical. He brushed it aside. Surely she wouldn't deceive him. She was family, blood, right? The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by Okonkwo himself. He wore a grave look, his lips tight, his eyes avoiding Obinna's. "Sir," he said, placing the folder on the table, "you need to read this privately." Obinna, irritated, tore it open immediately. At first, his eyes scanned the text without comprehension. Then his gaze froze on one line. Probability of paternity, 0%. He reread it. Then again. He stood up slowly, the page trembling in his hands. "This can't be right," he whispered. "Check again. This is wrong. This is a mistake." But Okonkwo said nothing. The silence was louder than thunder. Obinna felt the room tilt. His knees buckled. He dropped into his chair and clutched his chest. "She said it was mine," he mumbled. "She swore it every night." Panic gripped him like a snake around his throat. He dialed Amarachi's number, switched off. He called her personal assistant, no response. He sent a driver to the hilltop mansion. They came back with news that broke him further. The house was empty. Amarachi had packed her bags in the night, taken the baby, and vanished. Even the nanny had disappeared. But the real dagger came hours later when his finance director burst into his office. "Sir, we have a situation. Several of our offshore accounts have been drained. Nearly 2 billion Nigerian naira is gone. Sir, it's Amarachi. She was using fake authorization codes with Keen, your personal assistant." Obinna collapsed again. It was too much. His chest heaved. His head spun. His son was gone. His mistress gone. His money gone. And the man he trusted most had betrayed him. The press caught on within hours. Social media exploded. Obinna Jr. not Obinna's? CEO duped by mistress and assistant. Investors began pulling out. International partners backed away. The news was everywhere. His mother suffered a stroke and was rushed to the hospital. Staff began resigning. Friends stopped calling. Obinna stayed locked in his room, staring at old pictures of Chimamanda and Chizitere, the daughters he once called useless. His phone vibrated endlessly with insults, memes, and disgraceful headlines. Amarachi had sent no word, no apology, no trace. She had vanished like smoke. And for the first time in years, Obinna wept, not from pride, not from anger, but from the haunting realization that he had broken the only family that ever truly loved him. And now, they wanted nothing to do with him. Obinna's mansion, once a hub of laughter, parties, and praise, had become a hollow echo chamber of regret. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of his security system and the occasional phone ring he no longer had the strength to answer. His mother lay in a private hospital. Her right side paralyzed from the stroke she suffered the moment she heard Amarachi had fled. He visited her once, but the way she looked at him, with disappointment and devastation, made him feel smaller than a man. "You killed your own name," she murmured from her bed, her voice slurred. Obinna left without replying. He sat in his car afterward for hours, staring at his own reflection in the tinted window, wondering how the mighty version of himself had decayed into this brittle shell. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. With billions siphoned off and reputational damage beyond repair, several shareholders pulled their investments. A major international tech partner canceled a signed deal, citing ethical instability at executive level. Even worse, sponsors of Obinna's charitable foundation demanded their names be removed from all public material. He was hemorrhaging money, not only from theft, but from canceled contracts, lawsuits, and breach penalties. His once loyal staff, drivers, cooks, security, even his executive secretary, began resigning in quiet waves, not wanting to be associated with a scandalized empire. In desperation, Obinna sold 3 of his luxury cars and mortgaged the mansion Amarachi once ruled. The bank's tone was professional, but the undertone was clear. They didn't expect him to recover. In his darkest moment, Obinna turned to the one thing he hadn't touched in years, his photo album. In it were pictures of his wedding to Adanne, their early days of laughter, and the first images of his twin daughters as newborns. He stared long at a picture of Chimamanda asleep on his chest when she was just 3. She had drawn that moment years later with the words, "My daddy is my pillow." He hadn't looked at that drawing in ages. Now, it haunted him. He thought of how she used to wait by the gate for him every evening, how Chizitere would hide under the table to scare him with a giggle, and how Adanne used to call him my crown. Where had it all gone? He placed the photo down and wept until morning, long dry sobs that echoed through a house filled with portraits of lies. The constant headaches had begun months ago, but Obinna always ignored them. He attributed the fatigue, mood swings, and lower body pains to stress and lack of sleep. But now the symptoms worsened. He couldn't concentrate, his appetite was gone, and his weight dropped rapidly. One morning, he collapsed while trying to climb the stairs. Rushed to the hospital by his last remaining driver, he underwent a series of tests. Days later, the doctor walked into his private suite with a somber expression and closed the door. "Chief," the doctor began, "we found something." Obinna stared, already bracing himself. The results were conclusive. He was permanently infertile. Years of untreated infections from his reckless lifestyle had quietly destroyed his reproductive system. The damage was irreversible. Obinna's first reaction was denial. "No, that's not possible," he said, gripping the side of the hospital bed. "I have daughters. I had a son. His voice broke as the truth sank in. The girls were his, yes, but the son he paraded was never his. And now, he could never have another. It was a bitter irony. In chasing a son, he had destroyed the only family he truly had. "There are treatments, right? Pills? Surgeries?" he asked, panic setting in. But the doctor shook his head. "Your condition is advanced, Chief. We can treat the symptoms, but your fertility, it's gone." Obinna leaned back, stunned into silence. His legacy, the very thing he had destroyed his family for, had never truly existed. He felt like a man buried alive in his own pride. After being discharged, he returned to his home, but it no longer felt like a home. It was now a prison of memories and regret. He tried calling Adanne, leaving a long, voice-shaking message. "Please let me see them. Just once. Please." No response. He tried the girls' school, only to be told that a court-issued protective order had barred him from showing up without written consent. Even his name had become taboo. Chimamanda refused to speak it. Chizeteer once said, "He's dead to me," when a teacher asked about her father. The pain wasn't just in his body anymore. It was everywhere. His name, his face, the silence of his daughters, the locked gates of the only family that had ever loved him. He was a man surrounded by things, but utterly alone. Obinna's pride, once a towering wall, began to crumble under the weight of regret. For the first time in his life, he began to beg. Not for contracts or connections, but for love, for forgiveness, for a second chance he no longer deserved. He sent handwritten letters to Adanne, each one more desperate than the last. He delivered gifts to the girls' school, books, scholarships, even iPads engraved with their names. Every single package was returned. One day, he stood outside their school gate in the rain, soaked and shaking. When the girls walked out and saw him, they froze. Chimamanda stepped back. Chizeteer narrowed her eyes. "You called us mistakes," she said coldly. "You said we had no value." Obinna tried to speak, but the tears came first. "I was wrong," he choked. "Please. I didn't know I was already holding my legacy." Adanne arrived moments later and shielded her daughters. "Go to the car," she whispered. Then she faced him. "You think love is something you can throw away and buy back later," she said, her voice low and controlled. "You abandoned your own blood because they weren't male. You tore their innocence with your tongue, and now you want peace because you're sick." Obinna broke down right there on the pavement. He fell to his knees. "Please, Adanne, I have nothing left." She looked at him with a kind of sadness that cut deeper than anger. "That's what you chose, Obinna. You gambled with what mattered, and you lost." She walked away, leaving him kneeling in the mud like a king who had traded his throne for an illusion. From that day forward, Obinna became a ghost in the places he once ruled. He tried reaching out to friends for emotional support. None returned his calls. His charity board removed him quietly. Past business partners moved on. The staff at his estate whispered as he passed, referring to him as the man who buried his own crown. He lived with security cameras, locked gates, and constant deliveries from pharmacies. His health slowly declined, but his memory remained sharp enough to remember every insult he once threw, every time he ignored Chimamanda's drawings or dismissed Chizeteer's kisses. Now he sat in a mansion that echoed with silence, with no baby to hold, no wife to call him mine, and no daughters who wanted to hear his name. For the first time, Obinna understood the true definition of loss. It wasn't the money. It was the hearts that had once called him father. The weeks that followed were filled with silence, not just from his daughters and Adanne, but from the entire world Obinna once controlled. He sat in his office every morning, hoping for a phone call, a visitor, even an enemy. But none came. His phones barely rang anymore. The same employees who once bowed before him now passed without eye contact. Even his gatekeeper, Emmanuel, no longer stood up to greet him. Obinna had gone from a name that shook boardrooms to a cautionary tale. He tried to win back what he lost by offering Adanne and the girl's money. He sent over 10 million Nigerian nairas in a check. It was returned, torn in half. He offered to set up a scholarship in the girls' names. They declined. In his desperation, he tried calling Adanne's pastor, hoping that perhaps through spiritual mediation, he could be heard. The pastor's reply was firm. Your season to apologize is past. You're now in the season to live with the truth. Unable to understand why his efforts were met with coldness, Obinna began to revisit the past through journals. He read old emails from Adanne where she begged him to come to the girls' ballet recital, only to remember that he had chosen to attend a champagne gala with Amarachi instead. He found old school certificates from Chimamanda's competitions and drawings signed to Daddy, my hero. He buried his head in his palms as memories resurfaced, the times he mocked them for being too emotional, the day he told Adanne she should be grateful he hadn't married someone more fertile. The words, once spoken casually, now screamed in his ears like fire alarms. His redemption wasn't being denied because he was unforgivable. It was being denied because he never valued love until it had nothing to offer him. He attempted one final act. He showed up at Adanne's sewing shop unannounced. The shop was quiet, warm, and full of colorful fabrics. Adanne looked up, stunned but calm. The twins were in the corner working on designs. Obinna stepped inside, hands shaking, eyes glossy. Please, he whispered. Let me stand here and watch. Chimamanda looked away. Chizitir glared. Adanne spoke gently but firmly. You always told us girls were worthless, that we had no legacy. And yet, it is these same girls who now design for royalty, without a dime from you. She paused. You left us when we were weak. You cannot return now that we are strong. Obinna nodded slowly and stepped back outside. That was the moment he finally accepted it. Not all doors close with a bang. Some shut quietly, and you must learn to walk away. Obinna's physical health continued to unravel. The stress of the scandal, the heartbreak, and his rapidly deteriorating reputation had broken his immune system. He began losing hair, developed tremors in his hands, and suffered from chronic fatigue. His personal doctor, now the only person who visited consistently, suggested he travel abroad for advanced tests. Obinna agreed, and within the week, he was in a high-end hospital in London. MRI scans, fertility assessments, and urologist consultations all confirmed the same tragic truth. His body had been damaged beyond repair. The infections, some of which had gone untreated for years during his promiscuous lifestyle, had rendered him not only infertile, but highly vulnerable to kidney and liver complications. One doctor even asked, "Why didn't you come sooner?" Obinna had no answer, because pride never visits hospitals. He stayed abroad for 3 months, undergoing various treatments and procedures, stem cell injections, organ support therapy, alternative options, but nothing reversed the internal damage. Each passing day, his hope dwindled. Even worse, the money began running out. His legal battles back home, mounting medical bills, and the ongoing damage control campaign his PR team tried to manage all drained his accounts quickly. He had sold 4 of his properties, and rumors began circulating that he would be liquidating the Eze estate. Foreign banks froze some of his business accounts due to pending fraud investigations linked to Amarachi schemes. In a twist of bitter irony, the very woman he had chosen over his family had now dragged him into financial and emotional collapse, and she had vanished without a trace. What kept him awake at night wasn't just the sickness or the financial ruin, it was the memories. In his hospital bed, Obinna would often replay voices in his head: Adanne's gentle laughter, Chimamanda's early poems, Chizitir's first piano recital. The soft, golden memories became torture chambers. At one point, he recorded a video message, hoping they'd one day watch it. "I failed you," he said, tears flowing freely. "I had heaven in my hands and chose ashes. If you never forgive me, I'll understand. But please, know I carry this pain now not as punishment, but as proof that I once had something beautiful and ruined it with my own hands." He watched the video once and then deleted it. because he knew they were already moving on, and he was not part of that future. Upon returning to Nigeria, Obinna's home was no longer the same. Half of his staff were gone, the compound was quieter, and his once grand parlor was now lined with unopened mail and dusty portraits. But one thing remained, the draft of his will. He had once rewritten it in bold pride, declaring Amarachi's son the sole heir to everything he owned. That draft was now locked away in a drawer he could no longer bear to open. With slow hands, he called Mr. Okonkwo. "Come," he said weakly. "I want to change everything." The lawyer arrived the next day. This time, there was no pride in Obinna's voice. He listed every asset, every plot of land, every piece of art, and gave it all to Chimamanda and Chizitere. "They are my daughters," he said. They were always enough. But when the lawyer delivered a copy to Adanne, she read it slowly, placed it on the table, and gave a long, exhausted sigh. "We don't want it," she said plainly. "You see, we've already started our lives. My girls are building their own legacy. We don't need one built on regret." Mr. Okonkwo was stunned. "But, madam, it's everything." She nodded. "I know. But we'd rather earn our everything." The lawyer returned to Obinna and relayed her words. Obinna didn't cry. He simply nodded. That night, he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his own name embossed in gold on the family crest. The empire he had built now stood without heirs, not because they didn't exist, but because he had taught them that his love was conditional, and they had learned to live without it. The twins launched their fashion brand 6 months later, Shishi Threads, a name stitched from their childhood nicknames. International designers applauded their work. Adanne became a national symbol of grace and endurance. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs. When asked about Obinna, she simply said, "That chapter taught me how strong I am. That's enough." Obinna watched it all unfold from the confines of his now modest home. He no longer called them. He no longer begged. He simply watched, from afar, as the daughters he once rejected became the very legacy he would be remembered for, though not in the way he had ever imagined. The once majestic Eze mansion stood like a decaying monument of arrogance. The walls were still laced with imported wallpaper. The chandeliers still sparkled when the light hit them just right, but the soul of the house had long left. Obinna now lived alone. No servants, no laughter, no footsteps down the halls. Only silence. He no longer opened the blinds. The air inside was stale, heavy with regret. Each room whispered memories. The nursery he decorated for a son that wasn't his. The dining room where Adanne once served his favorite meals in silence. The balcony where Chimamanda used to wave goodbye each morning. Now he walked those spaces slowly, often pausing at doorways like a man trying to step back into a time he had murdered with his own pride. He often found himself in the girls' old room. Their bunk beds were still there, though dusty. On the wall, barely visible through the faded pink paint, were their height measurements marked year after year with dates and little scribbles. Shishi 6 years. Daddy said I'm tall. Obinna ran his fingers over them, lips trembling. One day, he found a shoebox under the bed. Inside were old drawings, stick figures labeled Mummy, Me, and Daddy, with hearts drawn between them. One picture had the words, "Even if Daddy is busy, I still love him the most." Obinna held the paper like scripture, his chest shaking. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of that room until sunrise, staring at a drawing made by a child who had once loved him without question. On his birthday, Obinna woke up hoping for something, anything. A message, a knock at the gate, a card. But the hours passed, and the only sound was the generator humming outside. No cake, no calls, not even a prayer. His loneliness had turned into a physical weight, crushing his shoulders. In the evening, he stepped outside and looked around the empty compound. The gardens were overgrown. The fountain was dry. He walked to the center of the yard and looked up at the sky, whispering a prayer not for restoration, but for peace. The gates remained shut. No daughters came. No wife returned. The house stood still, and the man who once demanded a son above all else stood alone in a palace that echoed with nothing but his own name. Months later, Obinna sat quietly at the back of a prestigious international awards ceremony in Lagos, hidden behind dark sunglasses and a low cap. It had taken weeks of reaching out to finally get a seat, anonymous, unacknowledged, and unpaid for. That night, his daughters, Chimamanda and Chizitere Eze, were being honored with a Humanitarian and Innovation Award for their fashion tech initiative, Shishi Threads, which combines sustainable fashion with education for underprivileged girls. The crowd was electric with pride. Adanne, radiant in a flowing gold ochre dress, stood beside them as the presenter read their story, not just of fashion, but of survival, of reinvention, of what it meant to rise after being thrown away. Obinna sat at the far back, trembling as their names echoed through the room. The girls walked up to the stage, poised and confident. Chimamanda gave a short speech, her voice clear and measured. "We dedicate this award to every girl who was ever told she wasn't enough. You are. You always were." The applause thundered. Chizitere added quietly, "To our mother, who carried us through the fire, we love you." Adanne embraced them as the cameras flashed. From his seat in the shadows, Obinna clapped slowly. No one noticed. No one turned. He didn't expect them to. He knew what he had done. He had called them useless. He had erased them for a fantasy. And now, they were standing on a platform that he was never invited to. His applause wasn't for acknowledgement. It was for atonement. A silent rhythm of regret. After the event, Obinna remained seated as the crowd emptied. A young usher approached him, mistaking him for someone waiting on a ride. "Sir, are you all right?" He nodded slowly. "I'm fine." The usher smiled and left. Obinna looked one last time at the stage, now empty. He stood, adjusted his cap, and limped slowly out of the hall. Outside, Lagos bustled as usual, unaware of the quiet heartbreak that followed him into the dark. No limousines. No entourage. Just a man once feared, now forgotten. As he walked down the lonely street, his voice cracked as he whispered to no one, "I had everything, and I destroyed it chasing what I already had." The night swallowed his words, and behind him, the hall glowed with the light of the legacy he could never claim, but would never escape. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.